You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Jaye Odom, who is a licensed psychologist in New Mexico with impressive board certifications in applied behavior analysis and bariatric counseling. She has also reached clinical reliability and a gold standard assessment, highlighting her commitment to excellence. Today, we'll be discussing how improving autism services in rural areas and the importance of cultural competence in reaching Native American and Spanish-speaking communities. Welcome, Dr. Jaye Odom.
Thank you. It's a nice intro.
I'm really curious, and this is going to be an episode where I think I'm going to learn quite a bit about, some of the underserved communities that maybe aren't spoken about enough and given enough of that playtime to really understand some of the challenges that exist. But before we go there, one of the things I'd love to be able to do is get to know why the field of autism or being able to work with autistics is something that is of interest to you or brought you to the field.
Sure. So I was interested in working with people for as long as I can remember. And then around high school, when everybody's trying to get you to choose or at least have a direction, I took an independent study class in psychology because my high school didn't offer any psychology classes. It was a lot more tech and science. That let me choose whatever I wanted to study within psychology. But since I was interested in social development, autism came up. And my mind was just blown. Like I had no idea that this existed or that people were struggling with this. And I felt probably as kind of this says speaks to my development, compassion for the first time, really, for a group of people that I didn't know personally. Like I just felt like they were a group that was really not getting the attention and concern and help that they should get. And I also felt like I maybe could be useful. And so then I started volunteering with the New Mexico Autism Society. And so I got to participate and help and interact with people on the spectrum. And it just grew from there. Like every experience I've had, which has been quite varied, I've really just loved it. And I'm just passionate about it and been lucky that my path has continued that way. So.
And today we're going to be talking quite a bit about the cultural integration of autism services and then also on underserved and rural areas. And maybe you can just give us a little bit of a picture of where you're from and maybe your cultural background so we understand, the context of what we'll be talking about today.
Sure. So I am born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but my family is all from Oklahoma, different parts of Oklahoma, various small towns, and also Oklahoma City, a few of them. But my tribe is from the southeastern section. Well, currently they reside in the southeastern section of Oklahoma, which is definitely considered rural. And the state of New Mexico as a whole is definitely considered rural, although I live in the city part, the more urban part of it. The vast majority of the state is very rural. So yeah, I think that's kind of fed into it for sure, that my family and myself, and then I've lived in other places that are more rural, plus the tri-state area. So I've definitely seen quite the variety of resources available to people. So
yeah, and one of the things that I've learned from our guests in the past is that it isn't just the geography of where you're at or the culture or the language. It's kind of the combination of all of these components that sometimes affects somebody's ability to get the appropriate service or diagnostics, or even that the tools match what you're going to be assessing. What is that, I guess, where your Native American heritage and even your fluency with the Spanish language, what are some of the deficits that you saw with the approach to evaluating autism that are right there front and center as you're approaching, populations that maybe these tools weren't validated for, or that you're trying to be able to navigate, some cultural context that doesn't necessarily align with the population that brought us more clarity to the definition of autism.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few. They popped up at the beginning of my interest in this to presently, within the last few days, and I think it will continue. But generally, I would say some of the ones that stand out to me as more of a pattern are, as Native American in the field, I was quickly aware that I was one of the only ones. Like there are more, and they're definitely putting themselves out there and connecting, but that it was not something that was typically done. And because of that, you see that on both ends of it. And by that, I mean, in terms of my training, my perspective was a little different and to what I brought to my learning and how I was going to do things, but also that a lot of people that are Native American don't even know what ABA is or have a very different view on autism and what matters to them and what would make somebody seem socially behind. And so I think there's a lot of confusion when people explain, first of all, what it is, but then there's also those barriers to accessing it in terms of what is this? Is it going to be helpful or not? Is it worth all the effort to get it? And then in terms of the Spanish speaking part, for instance, the barriers to that, as amazing as their skills are like in Spanish, it wasn't developed in Spanish, right? Like the ADOS was not developed in Spanish. None of the evaluation tools I used were developed in Spanish. None, like ABA terminology was not designed in Spanish, let alone really English. It's so jargony. So that's been really helpful in some ways because it's made sure that I really get it, because I can't just say, oh, this is a reinforcement schedule to a family, like in Spanish. Like that's not going to work. For me, at least when I was learning, I had to really know how to explain it in another language. Now, ABA España has a terminology glossary, which is fantastic, that you can kind of go back and forth. But again, still a barrier of like how you kind of explain this and how families understand it. So
No, and I mean, you had mentioned the scarcity of providers, and that's one of the areas that I think it's becomes even more of a challenge in areas where you have the confluence of geographic and cultural and language barriers all occurring at the same time. Because say in the community that you grew up in, and it was the Chickasaw Nation, correct?
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Within that community, is that I would imagine is that the education wasn't always available in the appropriate language, so that everybody in the community didn't quite understand, what ABA was, or even kind of the components of autism, is that every culture sees it differently. But the other hard part to this, I would imagine, is that you went to get your board certification and you went beyond that and became a psychologist. Is that the jobs aren't always readily available to go back into those communities. The funding sources aren't readily available to be able to pay for all those services. It's not as simple as a larger city where, you might have more opportunity. What are some of the challenges that you saw with even the funding or the resources available in the Chickasaw Nation sort of community
Mm-hmm.
that would be a barrier to treatment right from the get-go?
Well, yeah, there's been quite a few, I would say, over the years. And so this is just even my own personal knowledge of it. So I'm sure it expands, but really that even when they've fought for the state to pay for services, the state has still refused and essentially will pay fines instead of covering ABA services, which is hugely detrimental to everyone. And so there are other people. Shannon Dial is a member, or she works for the Chickasaw Nation, who does all sorts of things to try to make sure services are still available to families, but at the same time, she's had to be wildly creative. Like, she's fought and developed legislation for this. She's tried to and successfully obtained grants, but not everybody can do that. It's a very limited pool to get grants to pay for this, and then those end. Versus like state funding, which is like, no, Medicaid or other sort of funding must cover this. That's kind of forever, essentially, right? Versus like, okay, for 2 years, whoever can get in, we're going to try to reach you within this small, and hopefully your family's ready, and then deal with that.
And that inequity of resources that you're talking about, I mean, it automatically means that it's going to be a lot harder to be able to provide the same quality of care or the same frequency of care, or to be able to get collaboration amongst professionals, all of which costs additional money and resources. And if you're doing this with grants, or if you're doing this with trying to be able to manage it within a small nation budget like the Chickasaw Nation, is that they're not looking at a federal budget of the United States helping them out, or the state budget of Oklahoma or wherever it may be. It's like they're trying to do this all internally, which means resources are split across a variety of different services, making it so much tougher. So the access has got to be so much harder right from the get-go. Is that a deterrent in itself for families, just knowing that, hey, you know what, I can't even get the care that I'm seeking?
I definitely think so, because getting an autism diagnosis is not easy either. It's not as simple as, hey, my child's a little behind, I'd like some services, and they tell their primary and it's over, right? Okay, great. Now you have all these services. That's not at all what happens. And even the wait lists to get a diagnosis can be very long. And meanwhile, you're just trying to figure out and cope with what to do. And so the diagnosis part is challenging, and you need that to have a chance to get services. So if you're thinking like, I'm not going to get the services and I have to go through all of this, and they can be very expensive, like thousands of dollars to get a diagnosis. So I've definitely met with families that's been a huge barrier, and they've missed out because of that. Like, why pursue it? Why put my child through this? Why put my family through this if we can't even get help afterwards?
Are there unique strategies that you have to think through? Are there creative ways that you've heard people talking about, this is maybe an approach to be able to bring more services in the area? Is it a matter of more telehealth services? Is it a matter of maybe having mobile clinics that can help support? I mean, what sort of things have you seen that help to be able to increase the access to care in some of the areas that maybe there aren't enough providers or enough resources to go around?
Yeah, what you've said have definitely been helpful. So I do telehealth evaluations on weekends for families and adults throughout New Mexico. And I think telehealth can be really helpful for that for several reasons. I mean, the other barrier we're talking about is I've worked with families where the parents cannot get their child to go for 4 hours in a car and then stay overnight and then go through 4 hours of testing and then drive back 4 hours. Like, that's really not feasible. And to be able to address that can be very helpful in terms of telehealth. But then again, for communities and other ways, it's helpful to be there. So sometimes in my postdoc years, they had a setup. In my internship years, they would do things like mobile clinics where they knew the communities fairly well, and they would set up through a certain center there some sort of pop-up clinic that you could then schedule to be seen in person. But those would only happen a few times a year. And so you'd reach that community, but maybe 2 to 5 people, maybe, and then you leave. So yeah, I would say those strategies are definitely being used and are helpful, but still kind of limited. I do think community partnerships are the best way to do it because they need to understand why this matters and they want to understand that you're going to do something that helps them
Mm-hmm.
and to trust you on it. So yeah, recruitment. But recruitment is hard because of what we just talked about. If you're not going to reimburse the services, nobody's going to come to the place where they can't get paid to
Absolutely.
do their job. So.
Even those with unique ties to a community is that if they can't come home and find that right job and can't find a way to be able to make their bills work because, I'm not getting reimbursed enough to be able to be in this location and help the community I care so much about, is that they're leaving as well. And that does make it really tough. But you had mentioned that you're involved in trying to be able to kind of do some of the teleconsult and telediagnostics and services like that.
Mhm.
You're in a unique position is that you in some of these areas is that you understand the culture. And so how do you make sure that you're tying cultural competence or that you're moving that into your evaluations and treatments, and that's a hallmark? Because I would imagine is that every culture that you work in, autism presents differently, and the way that you're doing interviews with parents, so they're going to be relaying information very differently because they're prioritizing what they're seeing, which
Right.
has got to change a viewpoint. So how do you make sure that that's integral in your assessment?
So some of it we are fortunate that there's a few measures that are attempting to address that. And so I'll incorporate those. Like there are some measures, for instance, that are targeting female presentation because it's likely that our gold standard measures are going to still miss that
Mm-hmm.
because they were measured quite frequently, at least when they were developed originally, on a very specific population. And they are expanding and they are doing more research to kind of continue that and help with that training. But that's one of the ways. And so right off the bat, I say, okay, this is something I know females on the spectrum present more with. Or other comorbid issues. So, for example, women on the spectrum are often misdiagnosed with things like bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, which
Mm-hmm.
are not mutually exclusive, but again, like they'll have that sort of concern. And so I need to be aware of, okay, with your mood, I need to differentiate that, what's happening here, what's causing that. Um, and weed through those misdiagnoses that are not as common a misdiagnosis for some, like a male on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it doesn't happen, but again, just things that happen a lot more often in specific populations. The other thing that I generally try to include is questions. Like, so I start with, there's the eye contact question. That one gets beaten in all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but I usually try to phrase it instead of, is it well modulated, which is the jargony question.
Yeah.
More of, is it what you expect your child to do? Do you expect them to look at you when they're talking to you, and they'll might say no. That doesn't mean it's not well modulated. That doesn't mean they're not using it to guide conversation or in a socially appropriate way. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
they might think they're staring at them and that it's uncomfortable versus me coding it as, oh, that's socially normal. So I need
Yeah.
to like ask that question, is what do you think as a family are you expecting from them? How do you know they're paying attention to you?
Mm-hmm.
And then use that to kind of guide it as well. And also making sure I have the resources available in Spanish, really important. A lot of family, you'd be surprised how many families just expect like, oh, well, this is it. So I just have to
Mm-hmm.
do my best. Like I'll ask somebody else to read me the questions and that sort of thing. And that really gets in the way of your assessment. If you can't get the information in their language, or if you can't communicate with the child or individual in their language either.
Yeah. And
So all the
translation
pieces.
services don't always get there. I mean, I just remember back when my wife started her medical career, is that she went and did, I think it was like a 4-month stint out in Guatemala just to be able to learn
Cool.
appropriate medical terminology in Spanish. Like it was like, okay, so how do I, because you can go textbook, but then when you're trying to do it, it's like you're speaking two different languages still, because without slang, without jargon, is that now you've kind of missed a lot of the communicative ability. So I could see that being so important. But one of the things that I try and I guess I compartmentalize is the fact that, we need to have more providers. But the ability for providers to constantly be aware and to understand how to utilize their tools across different cultures, across different populations, across different languages is so hard. And it takes extra time. So people get deterred as that, well, I don't have that in my skill set yet. So how is it that that maybe you would encourage others, or maybe it is the use of community partners to understand things better within a community and to better inform you? But how would you suggest to other providers, you have this skill set or you have the resources to get there to understand, and you should be moving into some of these populations, or at least trying some of the teleconsult services to better serve everyone versus just a small portion of the population?
Yeah, I would say being open to creativity is really important. So it's a tough balance, but working with rural populations, I think, provides this very unique opportunity in that creativity is forced. Like if you want to work with them, your standard, like, oh, we all come into the office and the child is X age and we have these services already and this eval already from school, like that is just not going to happen typically with this population. And the measures were designed for them and both everybody's here. Like it's just not going to happen. And so being creative in how do I reach them, like I said, telehealth, even though there's that sort of balance of, well, how do I use telehealth, right, to assess this, or how do I use this measure then because I have to incorporate some other knowledge or experience, some other research that's indicating like this is better than this other measure, and being
Mm-hmm.
prepared in that way for this population, being willing to spend more time too, because it will probably take longer.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I'm saying with the balance is that we also, though, don't want to get so far out there where that's dangerous to a rural population and we feed off their desperation. That scares me too. So not doing things, being willing and open to things that have evidence,
Yeah.
and that could be helpful, and incorporating that along with things that have a longer history of evidence, and trying new things, but not things that could be dangerous or harmful or misleading because we've gone way too far outside.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, trying to
Because
balance that is hard.
yeah, but I think I resonate with that fear of watering down the service to a
Mm-hmm.
point where, is it really what was intended anymore? And I think that if that's in the back of our mind of, am I still doing what's appropriate for the client or the patient or whoever it is that you're using any sort of telemedicine with? And I still think that you can constantly do the right thing. It's a matter of not taking the shortcut and always kind of making sure that you're true to whatever form of science that you're actually practicing. Um, but the cultural piece to that is also, I think, a challenge. It's, even if I go into rural parts of my community, is that just working with the families and understanding a little bit about where their needs are and what their expectations are, it would differ from maybe a more urban part of my community. And it would differ even socioeconomically. It differs slightly what expectations are and what priorities of goals are. Would you say is that, getting that, I guess, community informed practice where, you really understand who's receiving the care, what they care about, what you're actually going to be focusing on is something that's universal. And if you're applying that, it kind of works across all the communities that you're doing.
Yeah, I would say as a framework, that's an excellent approach, is coming in with that openness to any community that you're working with, even if it's your own community. There's definitely been times where I've thought, oh, yeah, this is, somebody grew up down the street from me, we're going to view this the same way, and you skip the step, and then it
Mm-hmm.
comes back to bite you. We're like, oh no, that was an assumption that we were not the same on, even though I thought that. And so making sure that you come into any interaction with that in mind of like, okay, what are their needs? Let's center that. What's applicable to them, and that sort of thing. And keeping in mind, again, like their perspectives could be very, very different. I had a mother recently tell me, who's Spanish speaking, that she was really beating herself up because she should be expected to love her child no matter how he is.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be sad that they can't go to family functions for very long because he'll become so distressed and he'll start breaking things and turning lights on and off and running away. And she's like, I shouldn't be sad or upset at him for that, even though she's missing out on all of her family events. And having to talk to her about that is like, wow, it's really interesting, is that there's this cultural expectation for you that you should just love him and not do anything about that,
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of almost martyr in a way. She didn't use that word, but like sacrifice yourself because you love him so much. Versus, I think some other cultures would say, no, you should be doing everything possible to like fix your kid, right?
Yeah.
Like, and all these other aspects, right? So I think going in, being aware that parents and individuals have other narratives about what this behavior means than I
Mm-hmm.
do is really important.
Yeah. And I like that story because it's not always that you're trying to change their narrative.
Right.
It's you're working with their narrative. You're helping to empower everybody involved, knowing that that's the belief system and that's the values that somebody's
Mm-hmm.
sharing with you that are important to them, and how do you work treatment around that. And I find that to be extremely important and powerful in any sort of treatment model. Um, but you had mentioned earlier the value of some of these community providers, and I do want to kind of go back to that because I in any sort of rural community or any sort of underserved community is that the reliance on having more collaboration, whether that's with schools and medical providers or behavioral health services, along with kind of more family and even daycare situations. It's why is that so critical in a care model, is having this almost wraparound approach of everybody understanding how to be able to work well with whoever it is that they're trying to serve.
Yeah. Wow. Really good. Yeah, really good question. And it's, I agree, it's so crucial, and kind of, I guess, because I already said it, but it's also that without that, it falls apart, honestly, because a family or individual and one provider cannot meet all the needs of any sort of healthcare situation. And also, it can be very almost, what's the right word? Like counterproductive. If I think, no, this is the biggest priority we really need in school for them to develop peer relationships, but their teacher thinks, no, the biggest priority is that they can do algebra. And then we're kind of coming at a clash, and then the family's kind of confused as to where they put their energy and time, and the student and the school. And we really just need, even with different priorities, ways to address all of that together. And also why we think those priorities are different too, though, because of the families. Like, I don't care if they do algebra or have friends. I want them to have a quinceanera, or I want them to be able to go to a feast day, and then we're all pushing all these other things onto them. They're not going to want to do what we suggest
Hmm.
ever. They're going to want to be doing what they want to do to meet their goals for their family and themselves. And so to not have everybody together to support that and their goals and their needs is just going to fall apart, because nobody's going to be wanting to do what we're doing. It's just us
Absolutely.
arguing with each other. And to have those community partners also helps with that communication. Yeah, like they see them, they have more information. Like I've seen them in this context, like a teacher being able to tell me, well, I think their friendships are fine or where they're at, but if they can't do math, then they're going to be dependent on other people their whole life. And that's important to us culturally, that doesn't happen, or that sort of thing. And so having that communication can help out in all those ways and
Hmm.
prevent relapse, I guess.
Yeah, and not only that, but I mean, it probably allows somebody to feel and to be more empowered earlier in their treatment, so that you're not having this length of stay for treatment that is inordinate to what should be occurring. But you had, I mean, just even going through that whole discussion, I'm thinking, okay, so there's obviously barriers to the equality of resources that are allocated. And in underserved communities, it almost becomes even more pivotal that you're not wasting any of that resource. Is that if the school is able to help to impress upon any sort of the behavioral health needs and make sure they're being met, you need to use the school to be able to help support those. If the medical care is relying on a behavioral health team to be able to give them some information and data coming back on anything that they're doing, and you're not doing it, is that you're wasting very valuable resources when there is a scarcity at times. So I see that as so pivotal. Well, you've done so much good work on trying to be able to put this out there and be able to highlight the need for a lot of these pieces of our healthcare system that maybe require more cultural competency and more just conversation about. But not everybody has these resources to go back and kind of share with their communities. Do you have any resources that you would like to share with our listeners to help to kind of move these conversations along?
Sure. So it's tough because I don't, right, as we were talking about, it's not like every rural community needs X resource or even just every family or that sort of thing. And depending on where you're at, if you're a BCBA, what you can use versus somebody with a 3-year-old versus an adult that's, in rural communities on the spectrum. So I would say generally, if you have internet connection, then to use that by looking for virtual opportunities that would work for your family. So that could be something like an assessment, or if you don't think an evaluation would be helpful or you've already had one, there are a lot of actually great groups, so social skills groups that happen online that I think would be beneficial for anybody on the spectrum or family members, again, because the coordination of services that you have to do as a parent or is could be really hard to then also get somewhere and go from
Mhm.
there. And so there's a lot of really great groups for, I think, everybody impacted by autism or any other sort of healthcare condition, but that specifically, so they exist. So whichever
Mhm.
one kind of resonates with you, to look into those and participate in those. Usually whatever state autism society you have, those are pretty ubiquitous at this point. They'll have groups for families and events and things like that throughout wherever you are. And so being able to go to that and connect with people, so important.
Mhm.
Other things, if you don't have access to the internet or that sort of services where telehealth or other things wouldn't work for you, would be looking into different books and movies that would resonate with you. Thinking in Pictures by Temple Grandin, really fantastic book and interesting movie, especially because she is a female on the spectrum as well, and also an advocate. John Elder Robinson has also wrote a few books. He teaches a class at William and Mary on neurodiversity, or at least he did last time I checked. And so there's courses, there's authors, there's movies. Trying to find something that resonates with you and makes sense to you as to what's going on, I think is really important. ABA España, for any Spanish speakers, offers a lot of great resources as well. But otherwise, I think that'd be my most general way to do things. As a BCBA, I think if you want to do more cultural competency, there's a lot of things you can do. Like, right, there's a lot of trainings and people offer that in a lot of ways, but I try to be specific at this point. Don't just go in and say, like, oh, it's a training on how to be culturally competent. Like, pick an area. Like, I want to
Right.
be culturally competent with people, that are different from me in their language or their religion or whatever else, socioeconomic status, anything, and learn about that and work with people that are different from you and listen to them. And that would probably be the next step.
I mean, just even the work that you and a lot of your colleagues have done historically on just being able to bring visibility to this. You've mentioned females several times, but even the prevalence rate for diagnoses, that disparity, that gap is starting to shrink because more psychologists are understanding more and more about, the presentation that is unique to some females that for autism. So you're starting to see that. And the underserved areas, you're seeing a lot more of people that typically weren't diagnosed historically due to some of the access to care or some of the cultural barriers. That's starting to shrink. So I appreciate all the work that's being done. And Dr. I do appreciate you coming on today and talking about your unique situation as far as understanding of the cultural components of the Native American community, and especially the Chickasaw Nation, is that just understanding those pieces, and then what you've brought back to New Mexico as well, as far as being able to continue to provide that insight and care. So thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I listen to your podcast, and I appreciate all the space and questions. I learned so much from what you all bring out there. So appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.